this okay? Can you hear me? A little bit? Is that any better? Okay, perfect. So I'm thinking of some of the contemporary challenges to the field of gender studies. And I'd like you to take a look at the projection screens. I'm going to put up a few ideas. I wonder if some of these click for you, if you identify with them, if they make sense to you. Discrimination against women is no longer a problem in the United States. Most women misinterpret innocent remarks as being sexist. Society has reached a point where women and men have the same opportunities for achievement. Feminists want women to have more power than men. These are some of the ideas represented in the scales that are used to measure neosexism or modern sexism. So sexism has changed a little bit over time. It isn't what it used to be. And this is what I'd like to propose, is as it changes, we're coming up with new challenges. One of my students in the States once said to me, "Oh, Costa Rica, you guys have that machismo thing." I'd like to point out two things here. You guys and machismo. And I said to him, as I shook my head, it's like, well, machismo is the same word as sexism. It's the Spanish word for sexism, and you guys have it too. I'd like to point out how it's so much easier to see somebody else's problem. It's so much easier to see how they do it so weird, but of course we're evolved and we're enlightened and we're so modern and we don't do it like that anymore. The more things change, the more they stay the same. We have these ideas, these new ideals of change that we're moving towards progress and things are moving along, and yet they stay exactly where they were. This woman is protesting and saying, "I can't believe I still have to protest this crap." In 2014. This is one of my favorite protest signs, where I come back out in the street and I keep saying the same thing over and over, decade after decade. I can't believe we're still out here saying the same thing. So I want to bring up this concept of modern sexism. We've learned to do it a little bit different. We don't do it the same way we used to do it anymore. We don't say women are dumb and stupid and shouldn't be educated. It's gotten a little bit more sophisticated over time. Generally, you'll see that people are going to deny that it still exists. They're going to say, no, it's over. They're going to oppose the proposals for change. They might do it a little more subtly. Or they might just resent the changes that are already occurring. We'll see people talk about how it's over. It used to be a problem in the past, but it's not a problem anymore. Or it's only a problem over there. They do it, we don't do it, it's over. Or you'll have people saying things like they're asking for special treatment. Women are asking for too much. It used to make sense before, but now they have the vote. What are they still complaining about? We should spend as much time or money on men's issues as we do women's issues, because it's all about equality. So trying to insist that we make changes to improve women's lives, well, that's sexist, right? Because we're supposed to be equal. And on the end of it, you're going to see people saying they're starting to oppress men. This push for women's equality or for improvement in women's lives is actually starting to oppress men. So really what we need to do is just go back to the way things were. This is a lot more socially acceptable. It's no longer appropriate to discriminate openly. Nobody does prejudice as openly as they used to. It gets a little bit more covert, more covered up, more secret. They'll do it more subtly, like they'll oppose the specific policies and they'll say, well, this particular law, this one is wrong, or this should not be done. It gets really hard to measure prejudice because it's not socially acceptable to say these things anymore. And so people learn to cover them up very well. So as social scientists, we're wondering, how do I even measure this? How do I look for it? Nobody's going to tell me that they're racist anymore. Nobody's going to say that they're sexist. I'm not sexist, but it's one of my favorites. I'm not racist, but It gets embarrassing to say these things. We learn to cover them up a little bit more at a time. The thing is that this is a lot more dangerous than it used to be. Our goal is to silence, right? We want to make sure that change doesn't happen. But since it's covered up, it's a lot easier to defend yourself against it. It's harder to respond because it's harder to see. It's a lot more sophisticated. We add this up and we throw on top superficial change, which we see a lot of. Tokenism. We have this one woman president at the top. We've achieved equality. We no longer have racism in the United States because we have a black president. We have Barack Obama. Costa Rica cannot possibly be sexist because we just had a woman president. It's done. It's over. We have these empty policies that don't actually enact change. This superficial change makes elegant resolutions that don't actually translate into change on daily life. Brian was talking to us about this definition of sustainable development, right? He's saying that the Brundtland Commission definition of sustainable development makes sure that it's so vague and so open and so broad that nothing can actually change. It's a way to justify staying still. It's how we justify the status quo. We see the same thing with sexism. We use these new terms to justify making sure that people stay silent and change doesn't occur. And I'm proposing that this actually makes it worse. These little, small, superficial changes make it more difficult to create change. It gives you a false sense of change. It lets these people say, well, it's over. We have a ministry of women in Costa Rica, an entire ministry of women. What more could you want? You have the vote, you have a president, you have the ministry of women. Stop asking for so much. And I wonder, what does it actually mean for women's daily lives? Are we seeing the change? It serves to quiet people, to appease them, to lull them, to make them sleep and think that they've gotten the change that they were asking for. It takes the push out of pushing. It sends everybody home with an idea that they've achieved change. And I'd like to question where we can go from here. I'd like to question and be critical. I'd like to propose to you guys that you want to stay alert. You want to learn to see this new sexism happening. Now that you have a name for it, maybe you'll catch it as it's occurring. Maybe you can catch it in yourself. The next time you say, well, I mean, there's those radical ones. I'm not a feminist, but, or I'm not sexist, but. Learn to catch it in yourself. It'll also help you to learn to catch it in other people. When somebody comes to you and says, well, I mean, yes, change is important, but you don't want to be one of those radical feminists, do you? Learn to spot empty change. Learn to spot the empty, elegant words that mean nothing. Don't let them silence you. This is a push for silence. Please go home, be silent, and don't ask for change. And don't let them shut you up. I'd like to encourage you to push hard for changes. Since you're facing this pushback, this very soft, elegant, sophisticated pushback, it's going to take a lot more pushing from your side, or else you're just going to get swept away with the current. And I'd like to bring you always back to the indicators. There are some very clear, concrete things that we can measure and say, we're not done. There's a lot more change to occur. Go back to the indicators. This is a great place where quantitative measures show us some amazing things. Levels of education, levels of healthcare, levels of infant mortality and maternal death, levels of domestic violence, levels of sexual violence. These are some very clear, concrete numbers, and there is no arguing with them. They're horrific. So whenever you have somebody saying, it's over and we're done, go back and say there's still a lot to be done.
Thank you. Thank you. And by the way, I'm a feminist.
Thank you. My question goes to the second second to the last speakers on gender.
Where are you?
I want to draw you.
Oh.
I want to draw you back to the 1979 UN Assembly international document on the Convention on the Elimination of All Form of Discrimination Against Women in CEDAW, which is celebrated or observed annually. In these conventions, define discrimination against women as distinct, exclusion or restriction made on the basis of sex, which has the effect or purpose of impairing, and so on and so on. So my question is, in a remote village in Africa, where the men are allowed to go hunting and the women are allowed to go fishing because of their sex, is that contravening the CEDAW principle, or is that gender discrimination?
There's two reasons I really like your question. You brought up CEDAW, the Convention Against Discrimination of Women, 1979 UN, and you bring that back to a remote village in a rural area. And so I like the disconnect that you're pointing out between this huge UN resolution and what actually happens in people's daily material lives. So that's a great start. Thank you. And I like that you're pointing out who does what kind of work. That is one of the central questions that we talk about with women's rights. Who is doing what kind of work? We'll also take it back to say what kind of work is valued, right? What value is assigned to which kind of work. There's not the same pride in saying, today I changed a baby and washed a pile of dishes, than saying, today I designed a building. Okay? It is assigned different value in our societies. So you're bringing up how we define discrimination. How do we value and figure out what is discrimination and what isn't? And there's not often a clear-cut yes and no. I always like to complicate it a little bit more. I'd like to think about rigidity and flexibility if we're saying that the women have to fish and the men have to hunt, and this can only be so and it can never change. It's one of the first signs that we're looking at discrimination. When we have roles that cannot change, that are inflexible, they're imposed, this group of people has to do this and this group has to do that. I'll always wonder who's making the decision that this is so and it cannot change. Who got to decide who was going to fish and who was going to hunt? I'll always wonder where the separation is coming from and saying this line cannot be crossed. You can only do this activity and you can only do this one, and never can somebody flip over and try something else. I'll always wonder if there's a power differential and who is doing what. We talked a little bit about how work is valued. I'll wonder who's making these rules. Who's benefiting from these rules? Is it possible that the people who are hunting are getting more food and getting fed more? Is it possible that there's more, since there's more prestige in hunting, that they are given more access to a particular kind of resource? In some societies, there's been the justification that men need to eat more because they're going to run more as they hunt more. I'm wondering, does this definition, rigidity and separation, actually end up in a difference in people's daily lives? They're getting more food or more space. And I go back to structural and institutional discrimination, and we can say, where is the institutional discrimination in fishing and hunting? I'll wonder who's getting trained to do what. Is somebody getting to develop more skills as a runner and a hunter, or is somebody only being allowed to develop skills as a fisher? And so these are the questions I bring to you when we talk about discrimination. And if we can answer them, we can have a better answer as to whether there is or not discrimination.